us online, so we have to coordinate with our tech. It's a cliche to say that life can change in a single instant, but saying so doesn't make it any less shattering when the instant strikes in your own life. For the pregnant young mother at home in a village in the hills of central New Hampshire, the moment arrived in mid-September 1822 when it began to snow. Sarah was a New Englander, born and bred, and snow didn't usually faze her, but this was different. It was too early in the season for the first snow. Leaves were still on the trees, only a few had turned red or gold, and she stood at her front door watching the snow transform the village green into a sheet of white while she was filled with worry about her husband. David had left home that morning on horseback, heading for an appointment with a legal client 8 miles away on Lake Sunapee. He was lightly dressed, unprepared for the storm that no one expected. When he finally staggered into the house that evening, he was soaked through to the skin, shivering with the cold. Sarah helped him undress and get into bed. The cold quickly turned to fever and then ferociously to pneumonia. By September 25th, her beloved husband was dead. His funeral was held at the Baptist Meeting House in a ceremony conducted by one of David's fellow Freemasons. A month after her husband's death, Sarah brought their 5th child into the world. Little William joined his now fatherless brothers and sisters, David and Horatio, Francis and Josepha. The boys were 7 and 5, the girls 3 and not quite 2. The new widow had no illusions about what came next. David had made a good living as a lawyer, but like many young married couples, the Hales had no savings to speak of. Until the boys were old enough to go out to work, or until she remarried, an unthinkable prospect, she and her children would have no choice but to rely on the charity that family and neighbors might offer. David's brother Freemasons would also provide assistance. Even so, it would be a struggle. That was the opening few paragraphs of Melanie Kirkpatrick's book, A Lady Editor, a biography of Sarah Josepha Hale and the making of the modern American woman. Hi, I'm Anne-Marie Hauser. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at Hudson Institute. I'm joined here today with my colleague and senior fellow, Melanie Kirkpatrick, and the biographer of this book. She was a longtime journalist at the Wall Street Journal, and we have the pleasure of hearing more from her today about this book and why she wrote it. Before there was Oprah or Martha Stewart or online influencers, there was Sarah Josepha Hale. She is probably one of the most famous women, but mostly forgotten from the 19th century. She was a writer, a patriot, an educator, a style setter, and the godmother of Thanksgiving. You are in for a treat. This book is terrific. This woman is fascinating. I'm going to have Melanie open up with a few comments, and then we will have a curated conversation back and forth, and then we look forward to taking your questions to discuss this further. So without further ado, Melanie, welcome.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. It's wonderful to be here, and I thank you and Hudson Institute for hosting this wonderful event and giving me the chance to talk about the woman I think is the most, or one of the most important and influential women in American history. I'll make one correction to your to your introduction in the persona of Mrs. Hale. She, I think, would have liked for you to have called me an authoress, and you would have been a vice presidentess.
Okay.
She loved words that designated professional women as women. So here we are, authoress and presidentess.
Yes.
You mentioned that she's mostly forgotten today, and that's true. If she's remembered, it's as the godmother of Thanksgiving or as the author of Mary Had a Little Lamb, which I bet you didn't know. I always thought Mother Goose had written that, but it turned out Sarah Josepha Hale did in 1830. But I learned about Hale when I was writing my book on the history of Thanksgiving, and I was really blown away by her when I learned that she was editor of the most widely circulated magazine of the first half of the 19th century. And she had enormous influence over the culture of our country, over the idea of educating women, And she was, as you said, the godmother of Thanksgiving, the modern day holiday that we still celebrate.
That's right.
So.
That's terrific. Yeah, I wanted to open up with your writing and those opening paragraphs, because I think it really sets the stage for this woman is extraordinary for all the reasons you mentioned. But she was 33, debt-ridden, a mother of 5, and widowed, and she had some decisions she had to make. And it's fascinating. If she had ever remarried, we wouldn't have had this huge impact, I think, potentially she had in this country. Do you think that's fair to say?
It is. She was motivated because of the need. Her passion for educating her children. She was probably one of the best, she was certainly one of the best educated women of the early 19th century. This was an era when she started her magazine in 1828, only half of American women were literate, and there was no institute of higher education that it would admit women. Yet she, Sarah Hale, had been educated first by her mother, and who believed that her daughters should be as well educated as her sons. And then by her brother Horatio, who went off to Dartmouth. And of course, Sarah couldn't go with him because Dartmouth didn't accept women until the 1970s. But Horatio would come home and teach her everything he had learned. And then when Hale got married, she and her husband had a ritual of every evening they would sit together at the sitting room table after dinner, and for 2 hours they would study not just literature, but also science and French and botany and mineralogy, and subjects that were not usually considered women's subjects.
Right, right. I love what you said about her mother. She was profoundly influenced by her mother, who was her first school teacher. My mom's in the audience. I can attest to that. She's also a school teacher, and so I felt seen by Mrs. Hale when she said that. But she said, "There's no influence so powerful as that of her mother, but next in rank and efficacy is that of a schoolmaster." It seems like that really set her on this trajectory of just for her mother's influence and then also her husband. But maybe you could speak to some of these influences in her life that really had this impact.
I think you're right. Her family influences were enormous. Another influence on her was her father, who was a Revolutionary War veteran. Right. And she was a deep patriot. She was born in 1788, the year before Washington was sworn in as President of the United States. And she lived through the terms of 19 presidents. So she had a very long and diverse life, encompassing many, almost a century of enormous changes in American history. And I think that this background influenced her writing enormously. After her husband died, the Masons in town set her up in a millinery shop, and she hated it. So she decided that the millinery shop kept going, but she started to write. And she had already published, her husband had her publish a couple of poems in local publications before his death. And then she managed to get poems published in Boston publications. And then she wrote a novel called Northwood, which was an anti-slavery novel, and it came out in 1827. Right. And it caught the eye of a man in Boston who was starting a magazine for women. And out of the blue, he wrote and asked her to be the founding editor. So and she had to make a tough decision about whether or not to move to Boston.
Because, you can speak to that. Explain some of the difficult decisions she had to make when leaving.
Well, this was a tough one because she had 5 kids and she couldn't afford to take all of them. So she took the baby with her, and the other 4 children were parceled out to relatives with whom they lived for quite a few years before they could join Hale eventually in Boston at her boarding house.
Yeah, I find that so excruciating. I can't imagine what that must have been like, but she had to make a salary and...
Well, she had to make choices, and she decided that the only way she was going to be able to afford to educate the kids, as she and her husband had dreamed, was for her to take this job and succeed at it.
Right, right. And magazine startups, they're not known for being, a sure thing and succeeding.
Right.
This was
and this was an early one too. There weren't many magazines in America until the beginning of the 19th century, and there were some for women, but they were fluffy. And she was determined to do something very serious.
Yeah, you write that she really kind of changed the genre of women's magazines. That a lot of the magazines at that time were geared towards female readers were trashy and vapid, is what she said. She called them. Still true today in some ways. But you write that she wanted it to be, when she started the ladies' magazine in Boston, that an advocacy of female education, encouragement of American writers and American subject matter, and promotion of female leadership in charitable causes. So here you see the women's education piece of it, but you mentioned her patriotism. I think you said it was Dave Ramsey's book that made her a patriot for life. These two things, it's very clear how they were infused. Where did that come from, and why was she so different of others at the time?
Well, her patriotism extended to the idea that she firmly believed that while America had been unified politically by the Revolution, it was not unified culturally. And she set out to change that. So in her magazine, she did something that was surprising and different for the day. She decided to publish American authors writing on American topics. Now, from our point of view, this would seem, of course, ordinary, obvious. People want to read about American topics and American fellow Americans. But it was unusual for the day where cut and paste journalism was the norm. An editor would literally, cut out an article from a British or other magazine or newspaper and paste it into the dummy for his publication. And she set out to do something different. At the beginning, she had to write half or more of the magazines herself. But then when it merged with Godey's ladies' book, Mr. Godey had the money to extend her vision and pay the authors. She had a very good eye for talent. And some of the people who she published, you will have heard of. Edgar Allan Poe, for example, who called her a woman of genius, and excuse the sexism, masculine energy. And Nathaniel Hawthorne was another, and many others.
Longfellow?
Longfellow, yes. And she also published many women.
Right.
And she was able to jumpstart their careers by publishing them in the ladies' book. And people like the young Harriet Beecher Stowe, a quarter of a century before she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Lydia Sigourney, who was a very famous poet of the day, and many others.
That's, I think that's extraordinary. And it wasn't just, it was female education, but she also believed that women need to be educated so they could better instruct their children with the new republic's civic virtues. She called this the Doctrine of Republican, small r, Republican motherhood. Do you want to expand on that any further?
Yeah, this is a very important point, I think. As I mentioned earlier, when she started her magazine, only half of American women were literate. She deeply believed that women had the same intellectual capabilities as men, but the difference was that men were educated and women weren't. So she believed that education was a lifelong process.
Right.
She wanted women to be educated, to read and write and study subjects that previously had been considered too taxing for the female mind. But she considered it a lifelong process. And in her magazine, she would publish reading lists and articles about science and very serious stuff. But for 50 years, every issue of every magazine that she edited talked about the importance of educating women. And yes, one reason was, an essential reason was that, as you read earlier, a mother is the first teacher of a child, and she thought women needed to be educated in order to teach their children about everything,
Right.
particularly religion and particularly civic virtues. This was also part of the reason that she wanted a National Thanksgiving Day. She saw it as a way of bringing the country together.
Yeah. Right, which after the war, she was born right after the Revolutionary War,
Yes.
and then lived through the Civil War.
Yes.
And so she lived through this time where there was, we weren't 50 United States. I mean, we were very torn apart in many ways today in our country, but I just wonder if our country now would benefit from reading, obviously they'd benefit from reading this book, but would they be receptive to the efforts that she made to unify the United States?
I like to think so, Anne-Marie. The virtues of our American political system, which she touted, and which were very deeply held by her, I think they haven't changed.
Right.
And as the nation progressed toward civil war, she accelerated her campaign for a National Thanksgiving Day. And I guess I should give a little bit of history of that
Yeah, I was going to
first.
see if you'd, yeah.
In the early part of the 19th century, many of the states, but not all, celebrated Thanksgiving. But they didn't do it on the same day. The governor would decide when to call a Thanksgiving Day. And so there was an old saying, which I love, which is that if you were a traveler and you planned your itinerary carefully, you could have a Thanksgiving dinner every week between Election Day and Christmas. So
sounds delightful.
that sounds pretty good. Yeah. It's a lot of turkey, though.
Yeah.
But as the Civil War approached, she, as I said, accelerated her campaign, and she talked about how she wanted to unify the country and prevent it from going to war.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll come back to that and her later on, the president who she finally convinced to make this national proclamation. You spoke about her believing that men and women were intellectual equivalents. She didn't think that they were physical. She was happy to concede, men are built to be stronger than women. But she believed that the moral superiority of women was what it meant to be a woman. That we were morally superior, and that was our purpose in life. Unlike much of the feminism I think you see in modern day, she didn't put men down, from what I could tell from your biography. She, as a matter of fact, in her first magazine in Boston, we were just talking about the ladies' magazine, she appealed to the men because she recognized the reality, from my understanding, that they were going to be the ones who were going to buy this magazine because they controlled the finances for the wife. And so she appealed to husbands, fathers, lovers. You say that she wrote to the parents, there's going to be, basically, there's going to be nothing in this magazine to weaken parental authority. Nothing found on the pages of this publication shall cause his wife to be less assiduous in preparing for his reception or less sincere in welcoming his return. I know that sounds crazy to our modern ears, but in a way, I see it as very savvy.
I was very savvy, and I think her tongue was in her cheek a little bit there when she wrote this, but she was practical. She understood that men, fathers, and husbands had the authority, not just the financial authority, but they could ban the magazine.
They were the deciders.
From the house. They were the deciders. Mm-hmm. But this idea of women as moral exemplars is a very interesting one. Obviously, today we don't think of one sex as being more ethical or more moral than the other, but I think that there's something to it, because women are mothers, and women usually manage households. They, according to Hale, had, and I think I agree with this even today, had a certain status that and a certain responsibility to teach their children how to be good citizens and how to be good people.
Well, in the chapter, The Dignity in Housekeeping, too, she very much saw, she taught her children sewing and how women to take care of the house as much as being educated, but she created this idea of a professional housewife.
Yes, she did. She created the term domestic science because she wanted to elevate the status of housekeeping. And she also spoke a lot about educating housewives, educating mothers, because she said just as a farmer needs to know something about how to grow good wheat, a farmer's wife needs to learn about how to bake good bread.
Right.
But the whole idea of, this goes back to the whole idea of teaching. When she started in 1828, started her magazine in 1828, women were considered not to be qualified to be teachers.
Right.
They could teach small children their letters, but they didn't have the moral authority or the learning.
Right, the
education to teach older kids. So her campaign for many, many years was to change the national conversation about women as teachers. And by the 40s, by the 1840s, as the country was expanding and little villages and towns all around and the frontier were looking for teachers, women entered the teaching profession in large numbers, and by the 50s, the 1850s, there were more women than men as school teachers in America. And the last I looked, which was I think about a month ago, 76% of K through 12 teachers today are women.
Yeah, you don't think of that's not how it always used to be, right? That it was actually pretty astounding that it was her that worked to push for that in our country.
She also opened the first daycare center for women, for working women in Boston.
That's right.
She opened what is considered one of the first kindergartens for kids.
The infant school, or what were they called?
Yeah, they were called infant schools, right? And and then she worked very hard to support women's colleges and the co-education of men's colleges.
Right. And she was big on women being educated to be doctors. There were nurses and bankers.
And, This is interesting too, because she wanted women to be doctors, and she had a kind of a variation on the theme of separate spheres for men and women. You always read about the separate spheres for men and women in the 19th century, with women belonging in the domestic sphere and men being in the workaday world. She was different. She thought that women could go out into the world and work, but she wanted them to be designated by these S suffixes, and
doctoresses.
And she thought when it came to doctors that female doctors should treat children and women. No men allowed. She didn't want men to treat women or children. She wanted only women to do it because women had the compassion and, she thought, necessary concerns, I guess, that naturally
made them better qualified
than men. And this was true for some other professions. During the Civil War, she urged the government to appoint women as postmistresses, because she made the obvious point that a lot of women who were widowed by the war or were single and couldn't find husbands, and they needed jobs. And so she really wanted the whole profession to become female only. It was a job that you could do at home too, which I think made a difference as well.
Yeah, she really seemed to have an empathy towards widows as a widow herself.
Yes.
And sadly there were a surplus of widows during the Civil War, and which coincided with the popularity of her magazine and reaching them, which I think is significant. On the topic of women, she was a patriot, but we've got to bring up the question about the women's right to vote.
Yes.
And she was actually anti-suffragette.
Yes.
I'd love for you to talk more about that.
Yeah. From the point of view of the 21st century, being against suffrage for women seems abominable. And in fact, I think the reason that she's not so well known today as she deserves to be is in large part because she was anti-suffrage. Her reasoning, though, is fascinating. Number one, remember, she started her work in the Jacksonian period. She thought politics was a dirty business. And who can argue with that even today? And she thought that women were above the rough and tumble of politics, and that they deserved to be able to stay out of it and look at the moral issues that were involved and advise the men in their lives on the higher issues that they should keep their eye on instead of kind of the nasty compromises that they would literally fight about in the halls of Congress.
Yeah.
These were the days when men went at each other, congressmen went at each
caning
other.
on the Senate floor.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so she, after the Civil War, she got into the suffrage movement a little, the anti-suffrage movement a little bit. And I should point out that at this period, the vast majority of women in America were against suffrage. And so in a way, she was speaking for women whose voices were not being heard. And though I liked to think that maybe she was beginning to change her mind a little bit, because at the end of her life, she began to support women on school boards. And that, of course, is the lowest level, and in some ways the most powerful level of our government. It's down at the lowest level.
Very grassroots.
Very grassroots. And she thought women should belonged on school boards.
That makes sense. Her one book we talked about earlier, The Woman's Record. It's a, 2,500 women biographies. This book is a compilation of 2,500 biographies. I mean, she was prolific. And she called women God's appointed agent of morality, again.
Yes.
And she was 65, I think, when she
wrote
this
book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, according to the Yale Bibliography of American Literature, Hale wrote, edited, or contributed to 129 books, which is pretty amazing. And but the one that she thought was her masterpiece was called Woman's Record. It was a 900-page tome. Took her 3 years to write, and it was the biographies of 2,500 women, as you said, as the subtitle rather immodestly said, from the beginning of time until the present day. And she was very proud of this book, and deservedly so. It's the first work of history to put women at its center. And that's, in that sense, it was, I think, the precursor of the women's studies movement, which didn't begin until the mid-20th century. And there's a wonderful story having to do with Woman's Record.
Yes.
She was she became good. It took her a while at self-promotion, and she decided to send copies of women's records to notable women. And among them was Queen Victoria. So she asked James Buchanan, who would become president, but at the time he had just been appointed the ambassador to the UK. She asked him to take Queen Victoria a copy of her book. Now, amazingly, he agreed.
She was that influential.
She was that influential. He just said, yes, I'll take the copy to
Oprah.
Victoria. And rather more amazingly, Queen Victoria wrote back through her secretary saying thank you for the book. And I have to say this, I've always thought it would, since I read that, if I could ask the American ambassador to the UK to give a copy of Lady Editor to Queen Elizabeth, but I don't have Hale's chutzpah. So.
I can find a way. Speaking of Queen Victoria, she also was a trendsetter in her country, nation, but there were some certain influences. We've got some pictures up here, and these were incorporated into the Godey's Lady Book. This is, we were talking about Hale's influence, and you write that because she was this preeminent cultural influence of the mid-19th century, people would say, well, Mrs. Hale says, which, now we have Oprah's list, you can hear people say, right, this is how we talk, and But these are two things I didn't realize that because of her promotion of these in the magazine kind of took off in the country. We've got the Christmas tree and then a wedding dress, but it's a white wedding dress, which was not the standard back then.
That's right. Queen Victoria wore white at her wedding in 1840, and this caught on in Britain. Hale liked the idea and started promoting it in Godey's Ladies book, including publishing many, many drawings. And this one was from 1859, and she published the first, I think, in the late 40s, something like that. And so it caught on, and by 1850, she was saying that the white wedding gown is the symbol of young American womanhood, and et cetera, et cetera. And the Christmas tree is even more interesting. A London newspaper published a picture of Christmas at Windsor Castle, and Hale liked this idea, saw it, and decided to publish it in Godey's Ladies book. So she did, with two alterations. She removed the Queen's tiara, and she removed the mustaches of Prince Albert. It was kind of the photoshopping of the day. She hated whiskers on men. She thought it made men look sneaky. So that was one battle she didn't win. But she, those are just two examples, but she was very influential in other areas, such as recipes. She introduced the first recipes into an American publication, a recipes column. And then she published a couple of books of her collected recipes. Clothing was another example besides the wedding dress. She inveighed against corsets that were too tightly laced, and shoes that were too flimsy for cold weather, and
got some bonnets here.
Yeah, some bonnets. But all along, though, she hated fashion.
Right. She really railed against wanting to include fashion, and because she was like, this is a serious serious writing. But I think it sounds like she eventually saw the benefits of it because it also was a American fashion. She very much, even though she sent things to Queen Victoria, she very much wanted to establish this American identity.
Indeed,
and
indeed.
How she used that.
She actually railed against British and French fashion, saying, "We're Americans. When will we start promoting a Republican, lowercase r, fashion?"
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, she was very savvy with her times. I just think we take so much of this for granted, and then you look back and you realize that her influence is really on our country. She's almost like a founding mother of our country, right alongside. Do you think she would be canceled today? I mean, do you think?
Yes, yeah, for sure. I think she has been canceled. Before canceling was popular. The 20th Century Scholarship on her has, because of her anti-suffrage view, in my view, has dismissed her.
Instead of taking her whole life into account and all the things we've talked about.
Yes, I also think that after her death, she was editor for 50 years, and she died in 1879.
At the age of 90.
At the age of 90. And after her death, the magazine deteriorated. And I think that maybe she was falsely associated with that less powerful version of the magazine, and her intellectual accomplishments were forgotten. And certainly by the end of the 19th century, the whole idea of suffrage had taken over the women's movement, and people didn't talk as much about educating women as they did about giving us the right to vote.
Oh, that's really interesting. One last question, and then we'll go to the audience. Maybe you can just put a bow on Thanksgiving and her impact on the president.
Well, she loved Thanksgiving, and in her 1827 novel Northwood, there's what I think is the best description of an American Thanksgiving Day that I've read in American literature.
Which I think you put an excerpt in the back of the book.
Yeah, there's an excerpt at the back of the book. And in the 1840s, she decided that she wanted to try to get the president to call a national Thanksgiving Day. That is a day when every American would celebrate on the same day, and in America and abroad. She said she could see a day when every American all around the world would stop and give thanks on the same day. And this certainly was true when I lived in Japan and then Hong Kong. Americans got together on Thanksgiving Day. But so she had, besides talking about this in Godey's Ladies book, she also had a private letter writing campaign. And she would write personal letters to very important influencers of the day, governors, mayors, and presidents of the United States, and urging them to call a national Thanksgiving. And Hale being Hale, the presidents wrote back. And they all said no until Lincoln. They said no, just as a brief aside, because they thought that the Constitution did not give that power to presidents. They thought it belonged to governors. It wasn't enumerated in the Constitution, in other words. And I don't remember reading the word Thanksgiving in the Constitution, so that's probably right. So anyway, in 1863, she wrote to Lincoln, and he liked the idea, and he called in 1863 for a national Thanksgiving Day in a beautiful proclamation, which I urge you to go back and read. It was just after the Battle of Gettysburg, and the tide of the war had turned. It looked like the Union was going to win.
Right.
And Lincoln talked about Americans coming together as one people and celebrating with one voice. It's a lovely image, and one that we could heed today.
Right, we desperately needed it then and need it now. No, that's right. No, that's really terrific.
And then after Lincoln's death, Hale was indefatigable. She didn't give up. She just continued to write to the presidents for the rest of her life, and that was Johnson, Grant, and then Hayes, I believe. And they all followed suit, and by then the tradition had caught on.
It's a powerful woman.
Yeah.
That's terrific. All right, why don't we take some questions from the audience? We have a couple questions up here. Kirsten's got the mics.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. You began by talking about yourself as an authoress. Is this on?
Yeah.
And in the book, you talk about the influence that Sarah Josepha Hale had on what it means to be an author in America. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah, she, before Hale, being an author of a book was usually a private undertaking. That you'd either self-publish or you would find somebody who would stake you and publish. For example, Poe's first book of poetry was published by contributions from his fellow cadets at West Point. Hale's first book was published because the Freemasons, who had been brothers of her husband, came up with the money. But Hale thought that being an author could be a profession, and she believed that you should be paid for your work. And this was the idea she took as she started her magazine in the 1820s. And of course, as we know, the idea of an independent author, male or female, really took off, and people were indeed professionals. And you could also see this idea in the 1840s when Mr. Godey, the owner and publisher of Godey's Ladies book, decided to copyright the magazine. I believe it was under her influence, but I couldn't find any direct evidence of that. And he and she were roundly criticized for this, because he wanted to stop the practice of newspapers stealing articles from Godey's Ladies book and publishing them before the magazines could even reach their subscribers. And again, that supported the idea that authors should be paid for their work. And of course, I like this idea.
Right. Yeah, a lot of copying and pasting and stealing.
Yeah.
Julia?
Thank you so much for joining us today. Really fascinating talk. I was wondering, you mentioned that she published Harriet Beecher Stowe, and I know that she was a firm abolitionist. Could you speak a little bit about the extent of her involvement in the abolitionist movement?
Well, she wasn't an abolitionist. She was against slavery. She thought it was morally wrong. And I don't know if she ever knew any slaves when she died, when she was born, pardon me. The census a couple years after her birth showed that there was one slave in her little town in New Hampshire. But she certainly had visited this, I believe, again, it's not proven, documented. I think she visited the South, so she had encountered slavery, and her first book was kind of an imagined view of slavery in which it was clear that she was against it and supported the arguments against it. But she, being a great, I guess, being a woman of the 18th century, thought that the bargain that the founders had made over slavery should continue until the time that the country could peaceably get rid of slavery. She supported what was known as colonization, and that is sending freed slaves to Africa, to a colony that became the country of Liberia. And she did this because she thought that freed slaves wouldn't be able to succeed in America. She wrote a book called Mr. Peyton's Experiments that came out in the 1850s, in which Mr. Peyton, a slave owner, wanted to free his slaves, but he wanted them to be successful, so he didn't know where to send them, how to help them. So in the novel, he sends one group to a northern city, another group to a rural town, and a third group to Canada. And they all have terrible experiences. They face racism, discrimination, and they can't make a living. So in the end, he decides to send them all to Liberia. From our perspective, I think that was her attitude towards slavery. She certainly supported the Union during the war, no question about that. But it's hard to wrap my head around this idea. But there were many people of the day who thought that this was a reasonable idea. She didn't write at all about the moral after the war, but then by then she was in her 70s. She didn't write that I could tell anything about the moral duty of white people to ease the way and help freed slaves. So I think that is a shame and a deficiency in her work.
Nina and John.
Melanie, congratulations for this book and for reviving her, or introducing her to our generation. And she is an amazingly accomplished, influential woman, and holds many lessons, I think, in a timely way for our own issues of national unity and cultural unity and civic education. I wondered if she was, leaving aside this suffrage issue and the Civil War, was she controversial in her day? And was her work and her advocacy for women's work or women's role in society and education, was that considered controversial? Did she have a fan base and opponents? How did the other regions of the country feel towards her, like the South?
The South loved her magazine. She had about a third of the subscription of Godey's Ladies book was in the South, so that tells you something.
They love fashion.
Pardon me?
They love fashion.
They love fashion, yeah, fashion, right, okay. She was very, very popular. And I think Anne-Marie referred earlier to the phrase Mrs. Hale says when there was a dispute over a domestic matter or whatever. But also, I found newspapers of the day that would quote her on serious issues as well as frivolous ones, more frivolous ones. So she was an authority. She did not support the women's rights movement. She didn't like the idea of rights. She preferred opportunities as a way of expressing the fields that should be open to women. She was a very convivial and gracious woman. And there's a wonderful letter I found, no, it was an article, I guess, I found written about a visit that the feminist Lucy Mott made to her home in Philadelphia, and talking about what a gracious reception she had received, and she was sorry that Hale didn't fully support their cause, but that was okay. Everybody, could think differently. But she got into trouble a few times, and one which I think is that we really haven't talked about has to do with philanthropy. When she was living in Boston in the early 30s, a group of men had come together to raise money to build the Bunker Hill Monument. It was going to be a monument in memory of the first battle of the Revolution, and they couldn't raise enough money. So Hale stepped forward and said she would ask her readers and the women of New England to contribute. And she was public about this, and she did make calls in her magazine for women to send in money. And she was criticized by some men in a public way for doing this, because they said that men control the money in a house, and anything that a woman gives really is coming from her husband. To which she replied, citing a biblical passage, that women could, again, I can't remember this exactly, but women gave up their gold ornaments in order to fund something or other.
The temple.
The temple, yeah, the temple, yeah, I think that's right. So she got into trouble over that. In the end, her fundraising campaign didn't work. It didn't raise enough money, but a couple of years later, it was revived, and she started a fair, a big fair in Boston that raised enough money to complete the monument. And I think this is the first example of a woman in America as the leader of a major philanthropy. The women of Mount Vernon, the Ladies' Society of Mount Vernon, are often referred to as this was the first major women's philanthropy, but Bunker Hill preceded it. And in fact, a woman who spearheaded the Mount Vernon reconstruction was advised by Hale, and had a similar structure in how she went about raising the money. So she got into trouble over that, and I'm trying to think if there was anything else. I can't remember anything else off the top of my head.
John?
Well, first of all, thank you for bringing back the life of this great American.
Can you make sure that's on? Sorry. Make sure.
Oh, sorry. Well, I said first, thank you for bringing back the life of this great American to readers today, and I hope it gets wide attention. I wanted to ask, from your discussion, it appears to me that when you say she would have been canceled today, it sounds like, okay, she didn't push equality in the kind of absolute terms that both suffrage and movements today would do it, both gender-based and non-gender-based movements. But I wonder is the reason that she didn't engage in that kind of, well, this is the principle and that trumps or that dominates everything, is it a matter of her judgment about what was prudent in these kinds of social change for the country, or is it her republicanism that you see as important here? That what you have to do is you have to persuade people; they have to consent. I mean, the discussion you had about abolition and holding the country together seems to imply that she's waiting for a principle that people have to agree. There cannot be this kind of demand placed on them that overrides their decision. That persuasion is more important than enforcing whatever you may believe is a just principle. How do you understand her understanding of how you properly create change or engage in these kinds of you said she's not political, but of course she is post-political, and the cultural stuff is in a zone that's political and private. So how does she understand the parameters of proper action?
I hadn't ever thought of it in those terms, John, and I'd like to reflect on it. But she certainly was not. What's the word? She didn't believe in sort of top-down government or top-down edicts. She expressed her point of view, but she was certainly open to what her readers had to say, and she would publish letters from her readers. But I don't know if she thought of it in terms of lowercase r republicanism. You have to remember that the 18th century mentality about women was very different than what we would think of today. She, I think, overcame huge social, cultural hurdles just in pressing for education to the extent that she did, and pressing for women to be involved in the workplace in the same way that as she did. There were a lot of contradictions in her work, though. She was happy for women to be doctors or waitresses or teachers, but then she wasn't crazy about women becoming lawyers, because she just thought that area was more for men. How do you explain that? It's
beneath them, like politics.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe that it was too political. So, and in her own life, she said that she abhorred ambition in women, but yet look at her life. Surely, at some point after her kids had all been educated and left the nest, she could have retired, but she didn't. She just wanted to keep climbing to new heights. So I don't know, but she certainly did not believe in making demands on people. She wanted to open doors to women.
Yeah, that's a good difference.
Thank you so much, Melanie. This is fascinating. One thing that came to mind is that when she started, there were, in a sense, two big reform movements in the country. There was abolition and the whole beginning of the debate about the slavery issue and so forth. And the other was temperance, which was also getting started.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, it seems that she didn't really want to get into the abolition or slavery issue in a political sense, and it sounds like she didn't, because you said that a third of her subscribers were from the South, which I doubt would have happened if that had been the main theme. But did she push the temperance issue?
Yeah, absolutely.
Something
Yeah.
women would be interested in.
She was a very early supporter of the temperance movement, starting in the late 1820s. And she wrote a lot about temperance, and she published the most popular anti-temperance writer of the day, a man. And she wrote books about the dangers of alcohol and how it impacted women. There's one novella called My Cousin Mary, which is about Mary, who makes the fatal decision to marry a man who drinks. And you know what happens to Mary. And she ended up very unhappy. But she also, in her cookbooks, would inveigh against drinking too, and said that that the reader would find no recipes for alcohol in her cookbooks, though she did include recipes that included alcohol. It was
For beer, wasn't it?
well, yeah, and the idea was that the alcohol would be burned off before you actually ate the product. And one of her big philanthropies, along with the Bunker Hill Monument, for which she was remembered, is the Seamen's Aid Society, which started in Boston and then grew around the country, pardon me. And this was to help the wives of seamen who went off to sea and in many cases never came back because their ships sank. And she started a vocational school for the women. She deplored charity. She wanted women to have the dignity of being able to work for a living and take care of their families. Again, I think harking back to her personal story. So, and she would write about how sometimes seamen would come home and they would take the money that their wives had earned and use it to buy drink. And under the system of the day, maybe you've heard of the system called coverture, which it was a legal, a common law legal practice whereby a woman who married was forced to give all of her property rights to her husband. And the husband had the right to take everything she earned, everything she inherited, and decide what to do with it. She wrote many, many editorials trying to get that lifted. And I think her work had some influence there. But you know, some of the stories she would tell about women who were whose finances were ruined by their husbands were because the husbands drank. No.
Great. Okay, if there's no more questions, I will let Melanie have the last word, but before we break, I want to mention to everyone her first book on Thanksgiving, The Holiday at the Heart of the American Experience, is out on paperback as of yesterday. So this is a tremendous book. Maybe you've seen her in interviews around Thanksgiving every year. Melanie is kind of the authority on this holiday, and now the spinoff with Mrs. Hale.
Well, I guess I will conclude by saying on November 25th, I hope you will think of Mrs. Hale and also think of her hope that Thanksgiving will work to bring people together and to bring our country together and help take us to a better place. Thank you.
Thank you all.